This week we deal with the United States as the first setting in which to explore the development of a progressive alternative. And in the next 2 weeks with Europe. But it may work out that the American discussion runs over to part of next week because it is extensive, and then I may consequently reduce the European discussion. Now, I propose to organize this American discussion in 4 moments. In the first moment, I want to make remarks about at least 2 major turning points in American history, which are very revealing in their programmatic implications. In the second moment, I want to focus on a theme which is not uniquely related to the American discussion, but will accompany the entire argument of the course. And that is the role of redistribution. The redistributive impulse plays such a large part in the idea of progressives world over, including American progressives, that it's hard to have a programmatic discussion without giving it special attention. In the third moment of today's discussion, I want to relate this American discussion to the universal alternative that I'm trying to develop in this argument. And let me remind you here of a feature of my programmatic discussion which may not be obvious. A common position of the progressives today is that the orthodoxy is universal, sometimes called neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus. But the heresies are local and characteristically composed of combinations of the universal orthodoxy and of the national circumstances, the circumstances of the different sovereign states of the world. Like John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, I, on the contrary, believe that a universal orthodoxy can be successfully combated only by a universalizing heresy, as liberalism and socialism were in their day. And that's therefore the direction that my argument takes. In the fourth moment of today's discussion, I want to go from the critique and proposal of institutions to the critique and proposal of forms of consciousness, and discuss the role of certain large ideas, including spiritual ideas, in the American situation. Now, the first moment, the first historical period that I want to address is the period between the foundation and the Civil War, the antebellum period, the first half of the 19th century. In this period, there were 2 radically different regimes in the United States. In the South, there was a slave regime, a slave society that was to be destroyed in the Civil War. But in the North, there was a different economic and social model, an economy of petty proprietors, tradespeople, artisans, an artisanal economy. This second regime was also destroyed in the wake of the Civil War, as I will point out. It is impossible to understand what the United States became and what its possibilities and problems are today unless we comprehend the significance of this northern regime. The United States was built in the antebellum period by the convergent effect of two projects. The first project was a developmentalist project developed from on top, and very similar in many respects to the developmentalism of the 20th century. It was a nation-building project, and we could call it the Hamiltonian project because its major ideologist in the United States was Alexander Hamilton. Down through Abraham Lincoln, the presidents of the United States, all of them to a greater or lesser extent, regarded themselves as disciples of Hamilton. The Hamiltonian project was a nation-building project, literally. Its first element was the opening up of the frontier, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, and the development of the road structure of roads and canals and later railroads that opened the country up to habitation and economic development. The country was literally built physically in the course of this project. The second element was a heavy barrier of protection, of protectionism. The United States remained one of the countries in the world with the highest protectionist barriers down through the 1920s. Free trade prevailed only in the slave regime of the South. The plantation owners, the slave owners, followed the prescriptions, the advice of the English political economists and their doctrine of Ricardian comparative advantage. Never in the North. A third element in this northern project, the Hamiltonian project, was the organization and use of the public debt as the instrument of the nascent American plutocracy, especially in the North, operating through the first and then the second bank of the United States, its major financial instrument. And the fourth element had to do with the agency of this project. The project was orchestrated and implemented by a clique of politicians, diplomats, entrepreneurs, and speculators who, within and outside the government, organized this developmentalist project in the country. Now, the United States would not have become what it became if this were the only thing that had happened. The country was built as the result of the convergence of that Hamiltonian development project, a project of the national elite of that time, with the selective democratization of the American economy in what were then the two crucial economic sectors, agriculture and finance. I think that everything that happened in the United States subsequently has to be understood as the child of this marriage of the Hamiltonian project to these democratizing and decentralizing initiatives. The first sector was agriculture. The Americans developed the most efficient system of family-scale agriculture that had ever existed in the world up to that moment. The general belief of both conservatives and leftists at the time was that the process of agrarian concentration was inevitable and was an incident to an integral aspect of what Karl Marx came to describe as capitalism. The small farmers and farm workers would be driven out of the land, large land holdings would be created, and the ex-farmers or ex-peasants would become the workers of the new industrial system. The Americans consciously, deliberately, and vigorously rejected this prescription. They rejected the inevitability of this formation of concentrated agriculture. The government distributed the lands through the Homestead Acts and protected emergent family-scale agriculture against its combination of very unique risks. It's the only branch of economic activity that suffers simultaneously from physical risk, climate volatility, and economic risk, price volatility. They organized a system of price supports, of food stockpiles, and of crop insurance. And second, they created the cognitive basis of a highly efficient family-scale agriculture by establishing the land-grant colleges, and through the system of agricultural extension, bringing the most advanced agricultural science of the day to the door of the family farmer. That was the basis for this highly productive family-scale agriculture. An agriculture with relatively small scale, at least medium scale, but entrepreneurial attributes. And an agriculture which, to this very day, remains at the vanguard of world agricultural production. The United States is one of the two major agricultural producers and exporters in the world, the other one being Brazil. The second sector in which the Americans developed this democratizing project was finance. There was a struggle over the national bank. The first national bank was succeeded by the second national bank. The Bank of the United States was the instrument of financial speculation and of the accumulation of wealth by the financial speculators. And culminating in the presidency of Andrew Jackson, there was a struggle against the financiers and against the bank, which ended in the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States and in the striking prohibition in the United States for any bank to operate in more than one state of the Union, a prohibition that remained in force for over a century, although it de facto began to be eroded at the end of the 19th century when the New York banks, in fact, began to become national banks. So the problem, the task of ensuring the subservience of finance to the real economy, to production, of preventing finance from serving itself rather than serving the real economy, was solved by the brute, blunt instrument of a radical constraint on scale. And the result is that the United States developed the most remarkable system of decentralized banking that had ever existed in the world up to that moment. Through this radical prohibition of a national banking system. So my thesis is that what really built the United States was this combination, this marriage of the Hamiltonian project, its developmentalism, especially focused on infrastructure, to this selective democratization of agriculture and finance. Without the selective democratization, the country could not have become what it became. The economy of small-scale proprietors and artisans could not have flourished as it did. As I mentioned once before in the course, in the 1830s, when the National Bank was dissolved, only one white man in 5 in the North worked for another white man. So this was what in today's vocabulary you would call a property-owning democracy. The problem is that the democratization of opportunity and access was entangled in the radical constraint on scale. Both those regimes were destroyed by the Civil War and in the aftermath of the Civil War, not just the slave regime of the South, but also the petty commodity regime of the North. And the problem created by its destruction is a problem for the whole world today. And let me then go back to the remarks I made previously. Now in the world, the majority of people are poor and disorganized, but their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. Most of them in the world are not actual members of a small business class. That is, they are not members of an objective petty bourgeoisie, but subjectively they are petty bourgeois. They want to have a small farm, a shop, a trade for which they can charge. Yes?
One of the things that jumped out is that you explicitly talk about the top-down project in Hamiltonian terms, but then there's the second kind of more bottom-up decentralized
Talk
project.
down about louder, please.
You talk about the top-down project in terms of Hamilton.
Hamilton,
but
yes.
You don't talk about the more bottom-up project in terms of Jefferson, and I'm curious why you chose not to make that.
No,
connection.
just a claim that I'm making that in fact the development of the country followed the basic model of Hamilton's program. So later in American history, there were two main brands of progressivism. One was the brand that Jefferson had initially represented, but the agrarian populists and many others took up later, which is the little guy, an economy for the little guy. And that never disappeared in the United States. The second progressive project was the project embodied by the progressivists at the start of the 20th century. That is, strong regulation of big business by the national government, except that big business will control the commanding heights of the economy, but subject it to strong governmental regulation. Those became the two dominant progressive projects in the United States. They both had the same premise. The premise is that the market economy, and in particular the property regime, as the crucial legal device of the market economy, was inevitable. It was what it is. There was no way to combine radical decentralization with aggregations of scale. That's the problem that wasn't solved. That is, the defenders of this small-scale property-owning economy had no way, found no way, proposed no way to preserve the democratized, decentralized character of the petty bourgeois economy in the face of the relentless imperative of economies of scale. That's the problem which the cooperativists of the 19th century in Europe also failed to solve, and led Karl Marx to ridicule them as utopian socialists. So this dilemma with which I evoked in the beginning of the argument of the course is related to that problem, which continues unsolved. That problem cannot be solved by simply imposing on the private law of the 19th and 20th century a new body of regulatory and redistributive public law. That problem can be solved only by innovating at the level of private law itself, that is to say, in the regime of the property right. It's a very important problem. In a way, it's the crucial problem that you point to. Would someone like to remark on that, to make a comment about that? That's the whole basis. Now let me address a second moment in American history, which is the moment of Roosevelt's New Deal and of the war economy. So even today, the New Deal is sentimentalized. It's looked back to fondly by the progressives as their golden age. But it's important to understand realistically what the New Deal was and what it wasn't. Because the problems that the country and the world confronts now cannot be resolved within the limits of the New Deal settlement. You could distinguish 4 periods, 4 stages in a long New Deal. From Roosevelt's coming to power, at the beginning of 1931, to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War after Roosevelt's death. The first moment was the moment of active institutional experimentalism on a large scale. But this experimentalism had a very particular character. The New Deal focused on 2 devices. One device was the government as a last-ditch, a default employer of unemployed labor in labor fronts. For example, for the regional development projects such as the TVA. The second device was much more general and it was exemplified by Roosevelt's signature project of the National Recovery Administration. It was the restabilization of the economy that was in free fall. And its restabilization through what were, in fact, government-sponsored and government-protected cartels. It was what in today's vocabulary of political economy we would call corporatism. Concerted action between government and business to restabilize the economy, managing and containing competition. That was the second device. And these devices were, curiously, basically the same devices in the political economy of the early years of the Mussolini and Hitler regimes. Something which the Americans, of course, don't want to hear now, but that's the reality. And the reason why those devices were adapted is that those were the ideas of the time. The politician comes to power, and he imagines that the only problem are the practical obstacles, the opposing interests. But all of them are at the mercy of the ideas that are available to them. Roosevelt was a genuine and radical experimentalism. He said, try everything, try and try again. And he tried to listen to a wide array of voices, but he too was at the mercy of these ideas that were in the air in the 1930s all around the world. Stability and partnership of government and business, not radical competition, not radical innovation, not the creation of a productivist project. It was a project of putting the economy back into a stable situation. A year and a half into his first term, many of his signature initiatives began to be struck down by the Supreme Court and fiercely resisted by the business elites, including the National Recovery Administration, which was abandoned. And then began a second period of the New Deal in which the focus narrowed. The focus narrowed to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, of which the most characteristic instance was the Social Security program, but also the Glass-Steagall Act, the submission of the deposit-taking federally insured banks to a series of restrictions, and the division between proprietary trading and federally insured deposits. Only in one sector, housing, did institutional experimentalism remain strong. The governmentally sponsored organizations, quasi-public, quasi-state organizations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, became the basis for the organization of a national capital market and continue to have immense importance today. Then, with the war, begins a third moment of the New Deal. And we could treat this separately. Because under the pressure of necessity, the Americans got rid of their supposedly sacrosanct market ideology and did everything differently. The total value of military procurements in the first 6 months of 1942 was greater than the total GDP of the United States in 1941. So there's vast mobilization of resources. Financial, physical, and human resources on a sensational scale. And massive expropriation of private income. Americans who are alive today would have trouble comprehending that the top marginal rate of the personal income tax during the Second World War rose to above 90%. The economy was managed by a free-floating coordination, a consultation between big business and the government, with, of course, guaranteed supply and guaranteed purchase. Demand. And the outcome was sensational. In 4 years from 1941 from 1942 to 1945, the GDP in the United States more than doubled. There had never been in the country such an extreme upsurge of economic growth. The content of that upsurge was this combination of massive resource mobilization with radical institutional experimentalism in a fluid form. But the pattern of the war economy was not treated as a source of lessons for the organization of the peacetime economy. It was treated as a radical exception. Then at the end of the war and after the war, began what subsequently prevailed, which is consumption-led growth. Someone asked Franklin Roosevelt before he died, what book would he like to see in the hands of every Soviet child? Thinking that he would answer the Holy Bible. But he answered the Sears Roebuck catalog. That then became the linchpin of American economic growth. So looking at it today, from the perspective of today, what can you say about what it did and didn't do? Strikingly, it was not a productivist project, except in the forced production of the war economy. It was a project of restabilization and, to a lesser extent, of redistribution. And its most vigorous focus was to protect against economic insecurity. It was not a project designed to create an innovative economy, and especially to create an inclusively innovative economy. and inclusive vanguardism, which is what you might think is needed today. It was nothing like the project that I've evoked at different moments already in the argument of the course of replacing the knowledge economy for the few that we have by the knowledge economy for the many. And the whole emphasis was on managed competition, legitimate cartels, and coordination between big business and government with the assistance of organized labor. It is very clearly not a model for the creation of an inclusive vanguardism or of a productivist project. Now, of these two historical moments that I've just addressed, the antebellum period and the New Deal, strangely, it is the antebellum period which, in a sense, is in some ways more relevant to our discussions today. Yes?
Professor, I want to ask about your thoughts on the programs at the end of the Second World War.
Yes.
Intentionally attempted to kind of recapitulate the democratization of small property ownership.
Yeah.
In the antebellum period. I'm thinking of the GI Bill for education, which is analogous to the land grant universities you discussed
Yes.
with farmers, and also to the VA home loans, which allowed so many people to become small property.
On the side of entitlements, right? And entitlements that could, of course, have a productive use. That's true. But do you think that's similar to what you're comparing that to the Homestead Acts and to the creation of family-scale farming? I guess you could say so. And it's an interesting observation because there is, of course, a type of entitlement which crosses over into production, the kind of entitlement that empowers people. And that's where the distributivist impulse converges with the productivist project. And you could also say, with respect to the road building projects, Roosevelt's road building project and Eisenhower's road building project, that they were deliberately coordinated with the development of the automotive industry. So, in that way, it's not that there was no productivist element, but the whole emphasis of the New Deal was against fear, against instability. Not the idea of creating this fervor of an inclusive productivism, an inclusive vanguardism. And that's the sense in which I think it's not a good model for the fundamental problem now. And whereas the other historical moment, as I described it, of the economy in the North, required this marriage of developmentalism, the Hamiltonian project, with this selective democratization in finance and in agriculture. And that, in a way, comes much closer to the heart of the problem today. Because you could say that now in the labor force, increasing number of people are not employed by large business organizations. And in the United States and throughout the world, the majority of people are these semi-independent agents, or these petty bourgeois, and the problem is that they're condemned, consigned to some kind of make-work, stuck in these relatively unproductive and regressive jobs. So the revolutionary development would be to offer them an alternative. That is, to offer them a way in which they could reinterpret their petty bourgeois dreams in a way that would give those dreams the assistance, the wings of a more productive form of labor. And there are two crucial elements in that. One is the property regime. There has to be innovation in the property regime and in the forms of access. And the second is the redirection of technology, on the premise that technology has no intrinsic logic of its own. It has the logic that we give it. And this is very clear in, for example, the evolution of artificial intelligence, would say the aim of technology is not to produce a proxy for the human mind, to replace the worker, the mind, but to equip, to empower the worker, and to complement the mind with the imagination. Yes?
I just wanted to ask, like, to what extent do you view the democratized economy of the North in the antebellum period as, like, reliant on the slave economy that existed in the South? Like, the wealth accumulation that happened in the North, you know, maybe couldn't have been possible without, you know, the fact that the South had a economy driven by slavery.
Well, tell me more why you think that's so.
I mean, I don't really know, like, that much of the history of the
I mean, it would be a characteristic Marxist type claim that says the most oppressive thing is in fact a functional necessity of this other thing. But I don't see it carried out in detail, because in fact, the great majority of these small-scale owners and artisans had very little functional connection with the larger life. They didn't depend on world trade. And in fact, as I said before, the economy of the North was behind heavy protectionist barriers anyway. So it's not as if they needed these trade flows in order to finance something that they were importing from abroad. Now, there is one pervasive problem here, which is how we should think about redistribution. And this isn't particularly limited to the United States in the American example, but it's such a pervasive problem of our programmatic discussions that I want to say now, with respect to the American discussion, how I propose to approach the problem of redistribution. After all, in much of contemporary progressivism, redistribution is the whole story. And redistribution to be achieved by retrospective means, that is, by progressive taxation on the one hand, and by compensatory social spending, canonized in entitlements on the other hand. And I want to say as crisply as possible what I think the right idea is to have with respect to redistribution, of compensatory redistribution. There are three principles in hierarchical order. The first principle is that with respect to distribution or redistribution, that is, with respect to the distribution of advantage, structural change trumps everything else. Now, why is that so? So imagine the following thought experiment. You have a very unequal economy, like the economy that's emerging as the outcome of the knowledge economy for a few, the insular knowledge economy that we have today. The inequalities in distribution are anchored in the hierarchical structures of the production system, in the chasm that deepens between the vanguards and the rear guards. Suppose you say, well, there's no problem, we'll simply come after the fact, and we'll redistribute. We'll raise the tax level, the level of redistributive taxation. Or we'll raise the level of entitlements. So the economy creates all of these inequalities. We, meaning the democratic state, come after, and we cancel it all out. The problem is that if the effect of if the inequalities are massive, the redistributive taxes and entitlements must also be massive. And at some point, way before they reach the dimension requisite to cancel out the inequalities, they will begin to undermine the incentives to employ, invest, and work, and save, and the economic arrangements. So you say, you do all of this, you have this economic life, which is a tremendous machine of growth. Unfortunately, it creates inequality, but that's not a problem so long as we can come afterwards and cancel it all out. Now, the question is, the canceling will always have to be moderate, modest, and secondary. Because if the canceling is massive, it will begin to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And this intuition of the tension is caught in the familiar rhetoric of a tension between equity and efficiency. So where are entitlements most effective? They're most effective when they result from programs that increase people's equipment, as you suggested before, with respect to the GI Bill, for example. And that is the greatest historical achievement of European social democracy. The greatest historical achievement of European social democracy is to have obtained a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, in their education, in their health, in their security, in their physical integrity. And it's so successful that no right-wing government in Europe subsequently has ever managed to achieve a significant dent in this social contract. They pay high taxes, and in return, they receive high entitlements investing in their capabilities. The investment of the state in the capabilities of the citizens. But beyond that, beyond this investment in capabilities, we can't cancel out the outcome of the economic system by coming after the fact and redistributing. It can only have a minor accessory or complementary role compared to structural change. So structural change is, for example, if we allow a larger part of the population to participate in the knowledge economy, in the most advanced practice of production, as opposed to simply paying them or compensating them for their exclusion from the vanguard of the economy. Now, so that's the first principle. The first principle is structural change, meaning institutional and legal innovation, trumps everything else. The second principle is that with respect to the budget, on both the spending side and the revenue-raising side, what counts is not the progressive profile of taxation, but the aggregate level of public spending and how it is spent. So let me introduce this second principle by a comparative observation about the United States and Europe. On paper, in the North Atlantic world, the American tax system is the most progressive. It's the most progressive because it gives pride of place to the progressive taxation of personal income. By comparison, on paper, the European tax systems are regressive. They're regressive because they depend mainly on the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, which is obviously a regressive tax. So understand what the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax is. It's a tax that takes what in principle is a constant amount, a uniform amount, from the value of the transformation of every input into an output throughout the system of production and circulation of goods and services. Every time value is added, every time an input goes into an output, the tax falls at a constant amount. Of course, it's never completely neutral, but imagine it completely neutral to understand the logic. Now, how can it be that the most unequal of the rich North Atlantic democracies has the most progressive tax system, and the relatively more equal social democracies have a regressive tax system? Because that's what, on the face of it, the facts are. The explanation is that everything that the Europeans lose by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget, they gain in double on the spending side. The basic, simple reason why, in the aggregate, the European budgetary systems are more redistributive than the American is that they take in at least 10% of GDP as taxes than the American government. And why do they take in over 10% GDP, or how do they take it? They take it because they rely heavily on this regressive but neutral tax. Because the value-added tax is neutral with respect to the system of relative prices, it makes it possible to maximize the tax take while minimizing the economic trauma. It makes it possible to take in more in tax with less detrimental economic consequence. And that is the explanation of why the regressive tax can be part of a system which overall is more progressive in its impact. Now, this should not be a secret. This is an open secret, but no one explains this to the people. So, at election time, the politicians defend the progressive taxes as a way of showing whose side they're on. They know, or they should know, that that's not what works. But the debate, the national debate in these countries has not evolved to the point at which this is transparent to everyone. Now we come to the third principle, going down the hierarchy. Suppose you say, well, we still want to have a progressive tax for purposes of distributive justice. We acknowledge that structural change comes first, and we acknowledge that with respect to the budget, what counts first is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. What are, in principle, the two clear targets of progressive taxation? They are first, the accumulation of economic power. That's very hard to reach through taxation. By far, the best way to reach it is at the moment of death, through the heavy taxation of inheritance or anticipated inheritance by gifts inter vivos. The second target of progressive taxation is the hierarchy of standards of living, what the individual spends on himself and takes out of the common pool by spending it. That could be taxed very heavily. The way you tax that is through an individualized tax on individual consumption. That's the so-called Kaldor tax, because it was theorized by one of Keynes's disciples, Nicholas Kaldor, in a book he published in 1955, The Expenditure Tax. So what is this tax? It's a tax that falls on the difference between the aggregate income of the individual, his labor income and his capital income, everything together, and his invested saving. That difference is what he spends on himself. And that difference then can be taxed on a rate that is as steep as you like. There's no limit. A feature of the individual consumption tax is that the maximum is not 100%. The maximum can be, for example, 500%. For every dollar that you spend on yourself, you have to pay $5 to the state. Why not? The individualized consumption tax has no technical difficulty. no difficulty of administration any different from the income tax. It's the same thing. And if the progressives were both clear-sighted and sincere in their redistributive professions of faith, this is the tax that they would prefer. If they really meant to redistribute through taxation, this is how they would do it. After all, that's what the income tax is a confused hybrid instrument, which hits neither of these targets squarely. And in general, is a tax which rich people around the world do not pay. Rich people don't pay the income tax. So the income tax is basically, in the world, a tax on the salaries of the so-called middle class. And it's this confusion which hits squarely neither of those two targets. So in our discussion about the reorganization of the economy and of the democracy, we could siphon off a part to deal with the problems of compensatory redistribution and say, this is how we'll deal with it. These are the principles that govern redistribution. And that, in a few minutes, would dispose of a mountain of discussion and conflict, of course. In the real world, that's obviously not going to happen. But what I'm saying by this argument is, it's not because there's no solution. It's because the solution is not wanted. Now let me pause there for a moment to hear your observations about these ideas. It matters, doesn't it, whether this is true or not true? I mean, you could say, as it may not matter practically in the short term, if you think there's no way to do this. But it's a different situation if we know that there is a solution in principle, even though it's not yet acceptable. Well, what do you say? Do you understand the three principles and the relation between them? Yes. So the first principle is structure trumps everything. It comes first. Structural change trumps redistribution. Second principle, with respect to redistribution, what matters is not the progressive profile of taxation, but the aggregate level of the tax take and how it's spent. Third, insofar as taxation is to have a role in compensatory redistribution, the role is the one described by the third principle. There are two targets: the accumulation of economic power and the hierarchy of standards of living. The accumulation of economic power is best dealt with at the moment of death, or anticipated death by anticipated inheritance by gifts inter vivos. And the hierarchy of standards of living is best hit by the Kaldor tax, by the individualized tax on consumption, which I've just described, and which I'm claiming has no practical difficulties of administration. Because the taxpayer declares to the government the totality of his income and demonstrates what he saved and invested. Under this tax, what isn't demonstrated as saved and invested counts as if it had been spent. So it's in the taxpayer's interest to show that he saved and invested such and such amount, and that's going to be subtracted from what he spent on himself. And that can be taxed on a rate that's as steep as you want. The only limit is political audacity and political will. You could say, the rate's going to be 800%. You're going to pay 10 you're going to pay 8 for every one that you spend, and so forth. There's no limit. That's just a practical struggle. Now, what happens, I'm saying, is that in these societies, and especially in the United States, the discussion of taxation is a charade, because the insiders know that these redistributive taxes have only a minor effect. And there would be a way to redistribute, in fact, by this device that I described. Does that answer your question? So, yes.
I had two questions, if
Yes.
you can just put them both out, one conceptual and one maybe perhaps slightly empirical. On the first one, I just wanted to understand on your proposal regarding structural change,
Yes.
what its theoretical antecedents might be, in the sense that when Rawls talks of distributive justice, is there a clear separation between the goods that are produced through manufacturing and agriculture and then redistributed as the advantages of cooperation, and the means of production themselves, I guess, as things to be distributed under a distributive
A
justice?
separation between what and what?
Are productive justice and distributive justice completely distinct, or can we speak of productive justice or this productivist project?
I haven't said anything, or I've said very little so far, about what these structural innovations would be. And of course, that's the heart of the discussion in political economy. I'm simply saying that it's the alternative to the easy way out. The easy way out, it says, you have a market economy, it produces inequality. Let it be as unequal as it wants. It doesn't matter, we'll come afterwards and we'll fix it. That's what's wrong. Because if the inequalities are severe enough, you won't be able to fix it without destabilizing the production system. That's the problem. Now, of course, as you suggest, that doesn't tell you anything about which changes you should bring about. Of course it doesn't. But we're going to have, for example, the discussion of the insular and the inclusive knowledge economy. So anything that makes the knowledge economy less insular and more inclusive, in principle, would have a distributive consequence. And it would have a distributive consequence that would not be subject to the objection to compensatory redistribution. Any way of dealing with the problem of labor in a world in which an increasing part of the labor force is abandoned to unstable or precarious employment, and so forth. So in other words, it simply signals the beginning of the debate. It's not an answer. Huh?
If I could just
Yes.
I think maybe because of a lack of very strong knowledge of economics as it is in real life, I was just trying to understand what it means when we tax spending on oneself rather than income, including, say, capital related income from capital investments.
It's your standard of living. It's simply a way to designate the total that you consume. You take something out of the resources of society and you say, I'm not going to simply accumulate for the ages or for my heirs, I'm going to spend it on how I live. I'm going to live in a palace. I'm going to buy luxury goods and so forth. Yes.
Would it, what I guess I'm trying to say is that is spending on yourself necessarily better or more accurate information about greater concentration or greater amount of wealth, or what is it targeting?
No,
that
no,
would
the
it better
point
be
is,
targeted
no,
through?
no, we're making a distinction between two aspects of wealth. Why do we fear accumulations of wealth? For two different reasons. One is because wealth is power. And so you accumulate wealth in order to be able to command people, to buy them, to co-opt them. And so that's the problem of, the more difficult problem of controlling wealth through taxation. And I said there that the easiest way to approach that difficult problem is through inheritance. Through inheritance and anticipated inheritance. But now there's the other aspect of wealth. Wealth is a usurpation, an expropriation of the commonweal for the benefit of the individual. That's the other thing we feel. He's a profiteur, he's taking advantage. He's using it for himself. That's what we try to reach through the individualized consumption tax. Yes.
I think I'm trying to make it more tangible. What would that mean in practice? So, for example, if we taxate the spending, and let's say for every dollar that you spend, you're going to pay 5 to the government. Basically, you'll be eroding the purchase power around like 20%. So the idea would be that the government will be able to compensate that. So, for example, if you are living in the line of poverty, you probably won't be able to.
Yes, as a
cover for
practical
the-
matter, you would suppose the following, that below a certain level of income, and therefore of consumption, you don't pay anything. You receive. That's what the Americans call a negative income tax. As you go up, you begin to pay more. And you begin to pay more on a steeply progressive rate. At the top of luxury living, you pay most of what because you spend a lot relatively to the rest of the population, you pay a multiple of what you spend to the government. If the aim is redistribution, I'm not entering into the discussion of radical redistribution. But what I'm saying is, if the aim is redistribution, this is how you would do it. You wouldn't do it by this blunt, confused instrument of the income tax. That doesn't make any sense. And the rich people aren't going to pay that tax anyway, as we can see all around us. So in a sense, it's calling the bluff of the progressives in their debate. Because I think it's generally understood. This second principle, although it stated as I did may seem surprising, is not really a surprise. Most people understand, most of the professionals and most of the asset holding class understands that the income tax is a shell game. And in most countries, in most circumstances, relatively easy to evade. Yes.
Do you think that a luxury tax helps at all with this, or
Do I think what?
a tax on luxury goods, would that be helpful, or is that not? Does that not have a big impact?
I think that the great advantage is the neutrality and impersonality of the VAT, of the comprehensive flat rate value. that in most circumstances it's a mistake to begin to cannibalize it and to make differences and exceptions and say we'll punish luxury goods. After all, what's a luxury to someone is not a luxury to someone else. Someone may have an experience of spiritual transformation by drinking a certain kind of wine or smelling a certain kind of perfume. I don't need to be their moral censor, I the state. So I think it's not worth it. Once you begin to corrupt the neutrality of the tax, it starts to lose its charm and its efficacy. Why does it make it possible to maximize the tax take? Precisely because it's neutral, because it doesn't mess up the system of relative prices. So you get a lot of money for a minimum of economic confusion. You haven't touched the system of relative prices. You left it untouched. So from the standpoint of an economist concerned with allocational efficiency, that's the dream. And so you tell them, I'll give you your dream. I'll create this neutral tax at a high rate. Now, what happens in practical politics is that, in general, the progressives don't like the VAT because it's a regressive tax. And the conservatives obviously don't like the idea of having a VAT with a high rate because they want to minimize the tax. So the conservatives want the VAT with a minimum rate, and the progressives don't want a VAT at all. So they prefer to have a putatively redistributive tax and a society in which the aggregate tax take is much lower than it would be in the other place that has the regressive tax. That doesn't make any sense. But then come the theories of justice, like the Rawlsian theories of justice, which elaborate these principles of redistribution as if their whole objective were to provide a kind of rhetorical prop, a pseudo-philosophical prop for this exercise of compensatory redistribution by taxation, which is a mistake, the whole thing. So the role of these theories of justice is to serve as a kind of philosophical afterthought to the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. If you thought in the way that I propose to think in the first principle, that what really matters is institutional change or structural change, you wouldn't do any of that because you would be concerned with the content of the structural changes. What do I need to do in this country to create an inclusive knowledge economy, to replace the insular knowledge economy? Why don't we have a knowledge economy in North Dakota, starting with the simple geographical expressions and so forth? So now I've come to the third stage of the discussion, which is the allusion back to the transformative projects. And in this course of this conversation here, it's the content of the first principle, the structural change. So then we would have to discuss in detail the two projects that I explored last week. The project of creating a knowledge economy for the many, and the project of creating a high-energy democracy. So the high-energy democracy is the political counterpart to the knowledge economy for the many. Now, the high energy democracy, just to return to the discussion last week, is a democracy that facilitates the repeated practice of structural change, diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, and overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. And it depends, I argued last time, on 4 or 5 sets of institutional innovations. Innovations that raise the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in political life, innovations that accelerate the tempo of politics, by combining a reaffirmation of the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power in the state with a repudiation of the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. So the general idea is every time there's an impasse, you resolve the impasse as quickly as possible through the engagement of the general electorate in the resolution of the impasse. Like a political equivalent to Karl Popper's principle, that the point in science is to make mistakes as quickly as possible. Then the third principle is that you shape the constitutional arrangements so that they combine a facility for strong central change, strong projects by the central government, with the power of parts of a country for under certain conditions or with safeguards vetted by the political and judicial authority to deviate, to depart from the dominant solutions and generate countermodels of the national future. Because you want there to be a dialectic of projects in the country. And you want the alternatives not just to be disembodied doctrines, but examples. You want the country to be alive with these contrasting examples, embodied. Then fourth set of innovations, you would want to create a power in the state that is equipped to do something that no branch of the current state is equipped, legitimated, and resourced to do, which is to help come to the rescue of a group that finds itself caught in a circumstance of disadvantage or exclusion from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective economic and political action that are available to it. And so you then create that power in the state to do this piecemeal structural change to the rescue of the disadvantaged group that is both localized and structural. And finally, the fifth innovation you infuse representative democracy, the institutions of a representative democracy, with characteristics of direct or participatory democracy. You could do that from the ground up, local government, or the parallelism of local government neighborhood associations, or you could do it from the top down, for example, by comprehensive programmatic plebiscites, through which the electorate intervenes directly in national political life. So let's say that's one whole family of structural projects. A second family would be those that have to do with the economy. And of those, the most important now are those that contribute to the creation of a knowledge economy for the many. Let's postpone that discussion because it's a whole world unto itself. A third set of structural innovations has to do with the self-organization of civil society outside the state. Only an organized society can generate alternatives and act on them. And the question is whether this social organization is just a given or whether it's something that we can actively shape. And how can we shape it? Let me give you two examples. One example is by some system of national service, voluntary or mandatory. Says that every able-bodied citizen must, at some point in his life, either in the development of his career or early on, as a surrogate for military service, for example, perform social service. Ideally in part of the country different from the part from which he comes. The second example, the provision of public services. What we have in the world by way of provision of public services is what you would call an administrative Fordism. It's by analogy to industrial Fordism, industrial mass production. It is the provision of standardized, low-quality public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And you can imagine another system in which you say, the state is responsible for providing a universal minimum, a floor. The state also can operate at the ceiling in the development of the most costly and innovative public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state can partner with independent civil society, acting through cooperatives of professionals, medical or educational professionals, for example, in the provision, in the experimental and cooperative provision of public services, not for profit. In other words, you can have a way of organizing the provision of public services that is designed not only to enhance the quality of the public services, but to animate the self-organization of civil society. And then there'd be yet another area of innovation, which is in education. The education of the citizen, who is an active and critical agent, and a radically different kind of education. And the teachers qualified to administer it. And what kind of an education would be suitable to this high-energy democracy and this knowledge economy for the many? It would be an education that privileges the analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination. The imagination which distances itself from the phenomenon and subsumes the phenomenon under a range of transformative variations. That's how we understand anything. So the understanding of society and of nature depends on this empowerment of the transformative imagination, the ability to project, to imagine change. Those powers of analysis and synthesis of the imagination are not acquired without dealing with content. They're not acquired in a vacuum of content. They're acquired in dealing with content. But what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic superficiality, it's selective depth. Therefore, an education oriented to themes and projects. In its social setting, it must reject the juxtaposition of authoritarianism and individualism and accord priority to cooperation, to teamwork among schools, among teachers, between students and teachers, between students. And of course, there's a form of technical education that corresponds to this form of general education. Not a technical education addressed to job-specific and machine-specific skills, but a technical education that deals with the higher order capabilities required by the knowledge economy. Now, such an educational project couldn't be produced by a clique of educational despots at the center. It's a project of national liberation. And it requires the participation of thousands of teachers, of hundreds of schools. It requires to be developed collectively in the whole country. And there's one more feature of this type of education which I neglected to mention, but which is very important. It should be dialectical. Nothing should be taught just once. Everything should be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view, because that's the only way to liberate the mind. And once we abandon the objective of encyclopedic inclusion, we have time to teach things twice or three times. So the progressive alternative that emerges from this discussion requires initiatives in all these domains that I've just listed. And we're going to devote time, much more time, to each of them over the coming weeks and months. But now there's one final moment of the American discussion that I wanted to do justice to, and that is the critique of consciousness. Because a programmatic idea has a prophetic dimension. Now, one place to begin in the American context is what you could call the American prophets, like Emerson, Lincoln, Whitman. And what is their prophecy? The prophecy should be seen against the background of what you could call the American religion. Not just the religions that the Americans received or brought from Europe, but the religions that the Americans developed and that their prophets, like these that I just mentioned, developed. The religions they developed, that they invented, not the conventional forms of Protestantism and Catholicism, but Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Southern Baptists. The American religion or the American religions organize around the theme of the divinity of the human being, that the human being is not simply in correspondence with God, but that in a very real sense the human being is God, the human being participates in the inner life of God. And in the divine attribute of transcendence. Now, this American prophecy has always been subject to two taints, two heresies, two Christian heresies, because they are heresies within Christianity. The first is a disturbance in the understanding of the relation between self-fashioning, self-construction, and solidarity. So the individual imagines that he first becomes strong or prosperous, and then once strong, he is generous. So solidarity is then an afterthought to self-fashioning. And this is a heresy. Solidarity is not an afterthought to self-fashioning. It's a condition. It's a moment in the development of self-fashioning. The individual is not like a little Napoleon who crowns himself and then on his throne then distributes benefits to others. The second heresy is institutional idolatry. So this is a paradox in the American culture. The Americans are naturally experimentalists. Their characteristic national school of philosophy, pragmatism, is a philosophy of experimentation. But it has been their tendency to accord to their institutions an exemption from the reach of this experimentalist impulse. So we'll experiment with everything except our institutions. Many of their greatest thinkers, from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, tried to convince their fellow citizens to revoke the exemption which they accorded to the institutions. But on the whole, they failed. And this institutional idolatry is also a Christian heresy, because a Christian has to believe that although some institutions are better than others, all institutional arrangements are dust in the eyes of God. All of them are flawed. So this then is the role of the critique of moral ideas, of consciousness, which is an integral part of the construction of an alternative project in the United States or anywhere else. Now, to suggest the relevance, the pertinence of these concerns to the issues of political economy that we have been mainly discussing, let me go back to the beginning of today's conversation. So I said, the United States is the creation, the construction in its early history of this marriage of the Hamiltonian developmentalism and the selective democratization. And that marriage recurred in later moments of American history, during Civil War and Reconstruction, during the Progressive period, during the New Deal, but ever weaker. And why was it weakened? What was the problem? Why didn't this virtuous connection of national developmentalism and selective democratization continue, develop? Why wasn't it constantly reinvented? There were two problems. The first problem was the weakness of democracy. The Americans didn't organize a democracy when they founded the republic. They organized a proto-democratic liberal arrangement, deliberately designed to protect society against political transformation. And the second was the weakness of thought. So this interpretation that I gave of their initiatives in finance and in agriculture was not their own interpretation. They didn't say, these are two instances of the recreation of the market. The market has no single natural and necessary order, and we can go on and continue to reinvent it. And they didn't develop an economics, a political economy, which would illustrate that idea and develop it in many forms. It's we later, now, coming now, the Owl of Minerva looking back, who are imposing this interpretation on it. So the weakness of democracy and the weakness of thought made that marriage of national development and selective democratization harder and harder to sustain and to repeat and to develop. And into that vacuum then steps high finance and big business and a passive national government. The national government created by the cult of the Constitution and the proto-democratic liberalism. But we can't really say that the problem was simply that they made political mistakes. Because on the argument that I just made, I'm saying they also made spiritual mistakes. It's not enough to say that the nation hasn't realized the message of the American prophets. The message has to be criticized and changed in the process of being applied. So that's like a little model of the kind of programmatic discussion that I'd like to have in principle for every part of the world. For the whole of humanity. Subject in this way to self-criticism and transformation. We have a few moments. Would anyone like to say something about this American discussion? Yes.
Professor, it seems to me that what you're describing with the knowledge economy for the many is largely created in microcosm right now, with much of the educational system to the private capital pipeline in Silicon Valley. Do you view this?
In Silicon Valley now, you're saying?
Yes, but only for like a small ring.
Yes. You mean for them? It's like a club.
Yes. However, do you view expanding this model or like pulling down those fences through expansion of education, expansion of capital access as a viable way to access what you're suggesting? Or does
Well, I think, yes and no, right? Because I think what happens is now the Silicon Valley elite looks around it, looks at the country and says, why aren't the rest of the people like us? And so the easy solution would be to say, they just don't have the right education. If you gave them the right ideas and the right opportunities, they would become like us. And that's not true. Because I think the lifting up of the whole economy, of the mass of the common people, of this subjective petty bourgeoisie, as I call it, in every sector of the economy, especially in relatively unproductive services, is a massive enterprise. And it's not something that's going to be produced simply by mimicking the arrangements of Silicon Valley. So the Americans, ever ingenious, have actually done certain things in that direction that you described. The representative of Silicon Valley is a man whom I know, Ro Khanna, and he has presented proposals in the Congress about the equivalent to the land-grant colleges for the expansion of the knowledge economy. And that's a meritorious initiative, but it's just sort of scratching the surface, because what happens is naturally in the initial moves, people are hypnotized by the example of what exists. Like Silicon Valley, as you say. And so they begin with something that's an imitation of it. And that will turn out not to be the right thing. But that doesn't matter. That's the nature of transformation. You start with a crude imitation, you discover that it doesn't work, and then you go into something else. That's not a failure, that's a success. That's the nature of success. But I think there's also a spiritual difficulty in this enterprise, which is that much of what has to be done is a slow, relentless slog. Well, Max Weber said of politics, it's like boring through thick logs. And the difficulty is sustaining the visionary aspiration when you're dealing with all this unlovely stuff, all this boring, difficult stuff, which is the real stuff. And that's what that's the test, the ability to do that, to have this prophetic intensity and vision, and to sustain it in the presence of the common, of the banal, of the repetitious. That's the test of seriousness. And it's a test that we have to run. The country has to run it, the individuals have to run it. There's no alternative. That's my answer to your question. Yes.
Professor, your project seems to relies on spiritual turn or like a prophetic behavior. And how does your project would happen like in other kind of civilization, with other kind of religion and other
I
kind
don't
of
think it's
culture?
fundamentally different anywhere. I think, so the political prophet does what any prophet does anytime, anywhere, which is the political prophet has to present a foretaste, a foreshadowing of the future he proposes. And something that he can point to now that's tangible and that's an anticipation of what he proposes. He can't just propose a doctrine, a set of abstractions. He has to propose a set of examples. And around those examples, develop a discourse. That's the method of transformation. And that's what every political prophet has done, or any prophet. Cut out the political. And that's the nature of transformative action and prophetic vision. That you have to be able to anticipate, to bring to the present a suggestion of what you want for later. And because we all have to touch the wound to believe. We're all like St. Thomas. We have to see. And that's what we don't have in